Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about the Antonov An-2. Now usually I rather talk about the physics behind aerospace engineering than about specific airplane types, but this Russian biplane is somewhat special as it served as a quasi-VTOL without actually being a VTOL, and I thought I would talk about the specifications and physics behind this airplane, and I won't really go in depth about the history of the airplane. I might do a separate video about this if someone is interested, but for now the history is only a backdrop for the engineering. So the Antonov An-2 was developed in 1947 and produced from 1947 to 2001, and it was originally conceived as a utility airplane for the Russian Forestry Ministry, or rather the Soviet Forestry Ministry at the time, and it was essentially a cheap alternative to helicopters. Now, helicopters of course have the huge advantage over planes that they can take off and land vertically, which makes them really great for utility missions where you have to land, say, in a forest clearing, but they're expensive, they're complicated, they're not quite as reliable as an old propeller plane, they're expensive to maintain and repair, they eat up a lot of fuel, and they're just not really as cost efficient as a small airplane could be. They're also more difficult to fly than an airplane. And so they wanted to build an airplane with similar capabilities to a helicopter, not quite the capabilities as a helicopter, because they didn't need everything a helicopter could do. They didn't need to hover for extended times or such. They just wanted to land on really small airstrips or even without a runway at all, just in a forest clearing, but they did have enough space to roll for a few meters. It didn't have to be strictly a vertical takeoff or landing. And so Antonov designed a large metal biplane, in fact the largest single-engine biplane, that would have an incredibly low stall speed. In fact, it has no officially listed stall speed at all, and while it does of course eventually stall, like everything physically possible does eventually, it can be controlled down to almost a vertical drop. And due to its incredible large surface area to mass ratio and extremely low speed optimized wing profile, it would drop very slowly in this almost vertical or very steep drop, and could thus do a controlled almost vertical landing where the lateral landing speed would be so low that with the wheel brakes you could slow down and stop in less than a meter and practically have a vertical landing. This wasn't really the official landing procedure, but it could be done in an emergency. Officially, of course, you would land not quite as steep, but still at a very low speed and a relatively steep descent, so that you could slow down on a few meters of runway, and at that low speed and with this landing gear you wouldn't need a very clean or tough runway either. You could essentially land on a natural forest ground, and while it took a tiny little more space to actually take off since it needed to accelerate, and this usually goes slower than slowing down, it could also take off from small forest clearings without any actual runway. And for a propeller plane it actually has quite the thrust-weight ratio, although thrust-weight ratio isn't technically the correct term for a propeller plane, but it has such a large propeller and so much horsepower per kilogram that it could put in quite an acceleration, and combined with its low speed flight capabilities, a very short takeoff and a very steep climb. Its official climb rate is at 3.5 meters per second, but if really pressed it could climb twice as fast if absolutely needed. It's a little bit like the Piper Cup, just even more extreme. Although it's actually much larger, it has room for 12 passengers, it has an actual cabin in its back and a separate cockpit in front, and it could carry more than 2 tons of payload, and still be able to fly so slowly that on a relatively windy day, not even at very extreme winds, just on a somewhat windy day, you could turn the plane into the headwind and use that to essentially fly backwards relative to the ground because your airspeed was less than the wind speed. So if you flew into the headwind, you would be carried backwards by the wind. And of course, if you flew a little bit faster, you could control that and essentially hover vertically. Aside from its rough specifications outlay, its specific design was also rather cliché Russian design with more clever design solutions rather than fancy high-tech. As for example, the airplane did have fully automated slats that would make slow flying a lot easier, since you wouldn't have to take care of slat and flap deployment like on other airplanes. But these didn't use hydraulics or electronics at all. Instead, the slats would just be deployed by elastic rubber bands. And if you'd fly fast, the aerodynamic pressure on the wing's leading edge would push the slats in against the rubber bands and you'd have a normal wing. While if you flew so slowly that you would need the slats, then the aerodynamic pressure on the leading edge would be low enough for the rubber bands to slowly start pushing the slats out. And of course the design and the strength of these rubber bands were adjusted so that the slats would be at their optimal position when you flew at the speed where you would need them. After initially being designed as a utility airplane, it was later spread around the world in different civil and military agencies. It was used as a paratrooper plane by many militaries and also as a parachuting plane by many sports parachuting organizations. Its very slow speed being a great selling point for anyone who would jump out of an airplane. It was also used in its original utility role in different parts of the world as a rescue or utility airplane in rural areas where you wouldn't have streets or runways to reach certain places, and where you needed more or cheaper forces than a helicopter could deliver at the price. But nowadays it's mostly used by just historic old-timer airplane lovers at air shows just to fly this really great old-timey airplane. More notably, it was also used for testing different equipment and for testing early designs for ekranoplan wings. Ekranoplan actually being a large group of different airplane designs in all shapes and sizes, but most well known of course for the KM Caspian Sea Monster, another unique airplane that I might talk about in a later video. However, the basic wing concept for the Ekranoplan was first tested on the An-2, although of course scaled down a lot, and there was also an Ekranoplan version of the A2 that would also be a ground effect vehicle based on the An-2 airframe. Aside from that, there were many less notable sub-versions of the Antonov An-2, many modernizations, many with different landing gears like floats or skids for different terrain, and a few versions with different motorization, adding more power for more weight. Nowadays production has completely stopped in 2001, but the An-2 is still around as an old-timer airplane being flown at airshows, also in some places actually as a still used utility airplane and by many parachuting groups. And one An-2 that is no longer in flying order can be seen on Airport Stuttgart, right around the corner where I live. The airplane is on display on the visitors platform, and you can get close and walk around. Now I couldn't learn anything more about the actual history of this specific airplane, but it can be speculated that this used to be a Luftwaffe airplane because during the Cold War the Soviets supplied An-2s to the East German Air Force. Of course, Germany was split in two during the Cold War, and so there were two German air forces, a West German Air Force and an East German Air Force. After Germany was reunited, the airplanes of the East German Air Force still remained in Germany and were incorporated into the Luftwaffe, although the An-2 was already more of an old-timer by that time. It was still flown on airshows and has then since been retired, and since this is in Germany, it is quite likely that that is the past of this specific airplane, although I couldn't find any specific verification on where exactly it came from. What I could find is that until quite recently, actually, the airplane was still in operation as an old-timer that you could book very short nostalgia round flights on. So with this I will end this introduction to the rather special airplane that is the Antonov An-2. And of course, any questions or requests, be it on physics and aerospace engineering in general or on specific airplane types, are always welcome. And of course, thanks for watching.